Our next speaker, Dr. Sarah Fay, has served as curator of Eastern Hemisphere textiles and costume at the Royal Ontario Museum in Toronto since 2009. She holds a degree in Anthropology and African Studies from the University of Oxford and the Institut of langues and civilisations. All right, I can't speak French. The National Institute of Language and Oriental Civilisations from Paris. For over 20 years, she has studied handweaving, dress, and the social significance of cloth in Madagascar, and has contributed to numerous publications and has served as guest curator of the exhibit Gifts and Blessings: The Textile Arts of Madagascar, the National Museum of African Art, Smithsonian in 2002. Most recently, she has been studying the island's many historic connections to other cloth traditions in the wider Indian Ocean culture. With no ado.
Good morning, everybody. Well, these two papers are going to work well together because I'm going to be speaking now about the other half of the world, west of the Philippines. It used to be that the presence of aniline dye in a non-Western textile was grounds for dismissal, museums rejecting it as inauthentic and refusing it for acquisition or display. But much has changed over the past 2 decades. In our present era of globalization, scholars are again recognizing interconnection, the forces of trade, religion, and migration that have always moved ideas, people, materials, and art styles across borders. Concepts such as the entangled object and hybridity have offered a way to move past the entrenched notion that non-Western artists historically worked in isolation, exclusively drawing from and producing for their immediate family, clan, or kingdom. Blendings, appropriations, and borrowing in the arts may not be as old as the sea, but they probably are as old as humanity itself. And nowhere is this more evident perhaps than in textiles, commodities that have flowed far and wide from ancient times. Indonesia's batik, the Philippines' piña, Navajo rugs, Ghana's kente cloth. These are just a few of the traditions that blossomed in the past 400 years, and all the result of multicultural interactions and exchanges. And nowhere in the world are artful blendings more apparent perhaps than in the Indian Ocean, which has been nicknamed the cradle of globalization. Stretching 6,000 miles from Indonesia to East Africa, with India as its fulcrum, and further linked to the Persian Gulf, Red Sea, and China Sea, the Indian Ocean represents one of the earliest sites of intense trade, population exchange, and translocality. The part of the Indian Ocean I will be considering today has largely escaped the attention of art historians and textile scholars, and this is the ocean's western shores. Constituting a distinct subregion, the Western Indian Ocean is comprised of northwest India, primarily Gujarat, Yemen and Oman in southern Arabia, the eastern half of Africa from the Horn down to Mozambique, and out to the offshore islands of Madagascar and the Comoros. Monsoon wind favored annual circulations within this area, creating a unified trading space at least by 300 CE. The spread of Islam and Muslim merchants intensified from 800 CE, giving rise to cosmopolitan port towns, and ultimately the emergence of the Swahili civilization. Modern European involvement in the area dates to the late 1400s, when the Portuguese seized key port towns. After 1650, forces from the Arabian nation of Oman ejected the Portuguese and came to rule largely in their stead. By the early 19th century, the region was an integrated commercial empire, loosely governed by the Sultan of Oman, who had moved his base to Zanzibar, off the coast of present-day Tanzania. Trading routes came to stretch some 1,000 miles inland to present-day Uganda and Zambia. Now, early historians of this zone tended to focus on the exports out of East Africa, on the ivory, spices, and slaves that flowed outwards to Asia and Europe. Recent research is studying the goods that moved inwards. And, as in Southeast Asia, the major import was cloth, particularly cottons and silk from India, over 1 million pieces annually. Rather than a captive audience, Africans were sophisticated consumers, and their changing demands for fabrics had major repercussions for producing nations, including India, England, and the US, forcing their industry and trade policies to accommodate East African fashion. For the past 20-odd years, I've been carrying out research in the Western Indian Ocean world. It began with a study of the hand weaving in southern Madagascar. Then it expanded traditions throughout the island. In the past 5 years, however, it has become evident to me that understanding the look and the roots of Malagasy textile and dress traditions requires understanding the island's interconnections with the wider Indian Ocean world, and also beyond. This holds especially true for the two Malagasy textile types I wish to discuss today. The Raffia ikats of the northwest coast, which you see on the left, and the brocaded silks of the interior highlands on the right. These types are roundly considered the greatest achievements of Madagascar's textile arts. Madagascar, as you will recall, is an island about the size of Texas, lying 250 miles off the coast of Mozambique. It split from continental Africa some 30 million years ago. This physical isolation gave rise to unique species of flora and fauna, including the famous lemur. But the island's population, human population, has never been isolated. In fact, it was formed by people coming from points all around the Indian Ocean. Linguistic and genetic studies show that the major wave of settlers came from faraway Indonesia, probably some 2,000 years ago, and probably as early participants in the spice trade. They were eventually joined by Swahili and other African voyagers. The earliest studies of Malagasy textiles generally sought to trace influences in design and technology to just these two broad sources, Africa and Indonesia. This is a typical hand-woven cloth of Madagascar. I'll see if I can get this pointer to work. Oh, I see. To Asia can be linked to the general tripartite striping aesthetic. So we have a first bit with a red selvage, a guard section, and then this center field for which the cloth is named. And so this cloth, because of this center section, is known as the arindranu. The twining here at the end will also appear familiar to connoisseurs of Southeast Asian cloth, as will the fact that it is women and not men who weave in Madagascar. The Malagasy loom, meanwhile, shows roots in both the backstrap traditions of Asia and the African single-headed ground loom. Basically, it is a backstrap loom that is pegged to the back. Meanwhile, certain hand spindles appear to take their roots in Southeast Africa. Styles of dress and their terminology are drawn from both Austronesian and Swahili sources. So this is all a first blending, you might say. However, back in the 1980s, pioneering Malagasy textile scholar John Mack advised that we not forget the many other actors in the Western Indian Ocean world, above all, India and her textiles. Indeed, from at least 800 CE, Indian and Arab merchants made Madagascar a port of call. The Portuguese found them on the northwest coast of the island in 1500, trading in Indian silks and cottons. And in 1780, the single town of Mahajanga, which will be important to my story today, was home to some 5,000 Arab and Indian traders. The recent research I will be presenting confirms that both of these groups, directly or indirectly, greatly inspired the weaving arts of their Malagasy hosts. So the first type of cloth I'm going to explore today are the Raffia warp ikats of Madagascar. Now, raffia is the staple fiber for peoples of Madagascar's east and west coasts. The palm leaves are shredded and the lengths tied end to end to create a continuous yarn, which is then woven. Malagasy raffia cloth is usually simply striped, but in a very small pocket in the northwest of the island, in the vicinity of Majanga, into the 1960s, women of the Buina Sakalava people embellished raffia cloth using the warp ikat technique. Now, ikat, as we all know, entails resist dye, tightly binding part of the warp prior to dyeing to leave areas free of dye, and so once untied, create patterning. Few Sakalava ikats have survived, but it appears they were used mainly as furnishing fabrics. Two major types of these have been identified. The first are raffia prayer mats, like you see here. And if you attended the San Francisco Tribal Arts and Textile Show last year, you would have seen one on view. Most recently, the Minneapolis Institute of Arts has included a stellar example in their renowned African galleries, and other wonderful pieces can be found at the DeYoung, Fowler, and Royal Ontario Museums, with the largest collection at the Field Museum in Chicago, collected by the anthropologist Ralph Linton in the 1920s. These mats measure about 25 by 40 inches, and their design follows a standard formula. At the center is a stylized mihrab, representing either three arched prayer niche or a central arch, flanked by minarets. Clusters of stripes, which usually include banded stripes, line the selvages. Working within this grammar, Sakalava ikat weavers created variety by altering the colors and forms of the mihrab and the surrounding stripes. One ram piece has an embroidered marking which may represent the initials of the mat owner. A second ikat tradition existed inland. Near the village of Kandreo, women created large ikat hangings in tents, probably used as mosquito nets. Made in non-Islamic communities, these pieces may include anthropomorphic and zoomorphic forms. You can just make it out here. We have a person seated on a horse. Curiously, not one of the many early European visitors to Majanga makes mention of ikat. The first textual description, in fact, dates only to the 1920s. Nevertheless, scholars have always assumed that ikat must have come directly from Indonesia, carried on the first outrigger canoes to Madagascar. New evidence suggests, however, that ikat may be the result of more recent Western Indian Ocean history. In a 2004 essay entitled Indian Ocean Odyssey, Geoffrey Hess traced the intriguing and complex transnational histories that lie behind Madagascar's raffia prayer mats. In doing so, he documented a singularly rare instance in which the mighty India imported handwoven textiles from Africa. Basically, the story is this. Bora Muslim merchants from Gujarat settled in large numbers in the Majanga area in the 19th century. They commissioned prayer mats from local Sakalava weavers. At least one merchant specialized in this trade. The Bora employed the mats locally, sent some as gifts to the kin residing in Gujarat, or took them as souvenirs when they moved to other locales. Hess was thus able to collect pieces in the towns of Kitsepi, Majanga, and Antananarivo, as well as in Kutch, India. A third and little-known type of Sakalava raffia ikat also appears to take its roots in coastal commercial weaving. This is one of the earliest dated Malagasy ikats from the 1820s, today in the Peabody Essex Museum. It is likely a hip wrapper. My study suggests that it was made to replicate popular Asian textiles, then knowing a fashion sensation throughout East Africa, Madagascar included. And here we can see a Sakalava woman wearing one. In the case of the Peabody Essex ikat, ikat has been used to recreate the complex banding of the Asian originals. It is quite plausible, then, that the ikat technique was introduced to Madagascar only in the early 19th century, directly or indirectly by Indian and Arab merchants, and thus why it was confined to a tiny pocket of the island, one with dense connections to Indian Ocean trade networks. In any case, what can be said is India is heavily implicated in the raffia ikat traditions of Madagascar. Now, the second Malagasy textile type I present today is this. It may look quite different from the Raffia that we've seen, but in the end, it may not be so different in its history. This brocaded silk cloth is known as a kutifan or kutifana. Measuring some 1.5 by 2.5 yards, it was worn as a shoulder wrap by elite men and women in highland Madagascar. The most luxurious of Malagasy weavings, it was worth 4 times plain silk cloth. The textile is unusual in many ways, breaking rather radically with prevailing Malagasy aesthetics. In the late 18th century, the most prestigious and expensive shoulder cloth looked like this. It was made of heavy indigenous wild silk, dyed in dark indigo or red colors, and decorated with heavy metal beads. The kutifan, on the other hand, is made usually entirely of lustrous Chinese silk, bombyx mori, which is not native to the island. Its typical colors are vivid magenta, turquoise blue, yellow, reds, and green. But making it distinctive are its brocaded motifs, made of discontinuous supplementary wefts. Mostly they are geometrical, but may include plant, bird, or anthropomorphic forms. You may know the akutifan through the contemporary creations of Lamba Inc., an atelier founded by Englishman Simon Pearce. Created for sale to international art markets, Lamba Inc.'s pieces have been prominently displayed at the Met and Smithsonian. Recently, the atelier created an akutifan using pure spider silk, which toured the V&A, American Museum of Natural History, and Chicago Institute of Arts. Historically, akutifan were only produced in the central highlands of Madagascar, in an area known as Imern. This landlocked area of terraced rice fields, which rises to some 2,000 meters above sea level, is home to the Meren people and their former royal capital of Antananarivo. An influential early publication on the akutifan, based on no evidence whatsoever, claimed that certain motifs represent birds guarding trees of life, implying Southeast Asian origins and religious meanings. More recent scholars have looked for meaning closer to home. They reasonably conjecture the cloth's colors or motifs might encode aristocratic or political rank, or be associated with the royal court. There have been suggestions that British missionaries introduced dyes, but the general interpretation was a timeless sacred mantle reserved for religious, political, or ritual purposes, one far removed from external influences, market forces, or trading networks. My own research for the past 4 years suggests a rather different story, one that also takes its root in the tides and currents of recent Western Indian Ocean history. And while India here too likely had a large role to play, so too did Oman in southern Arabia. Understanding the akutifan requires breaking past 2 stubborn misconceptions. Number 1, that the Meren were isolated from the outside world until the arrival of British missionaries or French colonizers in the 19th century. And 2, that weavers produced only for family consumption. Recent historical studies stress from at least the 1600s, central Madagascar was heavily involved in international trade. To combat the constant threat of famine, leaders encouraged massive public irrigation works, craft production, and trade. Swahili, Arab, and European merchants regularly traveled up to Imern, while the Meren ported goods down to the coast. Their major item of exchange were locally manufactured clothing, jewelry, and tools. Up to 1/3 of Meren men were part or full-time smiths, but it was women in weaving that contributed most substantially to the early modern Meren economy. Long acknowledged for continental Africa, the commercial orientation of much cloth making in Madagascar has now been recognized. By at least the 18th century, the majority of Meren women were professional weavers who channeled their products into a sophisticated network of weekly markets. Their most costly cloths were, at first, mostly traded to the coasts, to wealthy coastal Malagasy, who then controlled international trade. From the late 18th century, the Meren themselves came to dominate the island's external trade, with consequences for highland weavers. In the 1780s, King Andrunipuni Meren gained control of the export slave trade. Wealth, power, foreign goods, and merchants now flowed upwards to the highlands. The Meren channeled much of their wealth into imported cloth, notably silks from Surat in northwest India. These were brought to Imerran by Swahili and Arab traders and available for sale in markets and shops. Rather than dampen local weaving, these imports stimulated production and innovation. Responding to the new fashion for bombex silk, weavers adopted it into their repertories. They might combine it with the local wild silk, which you can see here at the center in its natural color, or make pieces entirely of bombex. The surge in bombex weaving in Imerran was further encouraged by an uptick in supply. The main source can be traced to Oman in southern Arabia. In the late 1700s, Oman's merchant rulers controlled the mouth of the Persian Gulf and that region's rich supplies of silk. Traders channeled much of this silk into Oman's own weaving industry, but some they traded to their growing commercial empire in East Africa. By 1817 at least, Arab and Indian merchants were bringing skeins directly to Imerran. Omani silk floss proved more than a raw material, however. It helped shape and drive Imerran bombex weaving. Reports showed that at first Imerran weavers had difficulty dyeing bombex silk, and so imported pre-dyed skeins in magenta, light blue, and purple, the colors of the Omani palette. In addition, Omani styles of woven cloth became highly popular in Madagascar, including the highlands. Arab dress was partially adopted at the Imerran court. You can see that the Royal Madagascar coat of arms includes it. Which was carrying on diplomatic relations with the Sultan of Oman, who had recently located to Zanzibar. The striping style of the most popular form of the Imerran brocaded cloth, known as the arusi, closely resembles the Omani royal turban. The fringe finishing characteristic of mid-19th century Imerran silks, which is a woven end band with bald fringe, may likewise be traced with some certainty to southern Arabian influence. In fact, the dyes used in creating akutifana reveal the incredible reach of the global trade in weaving supplies, not just cloth. Dye analyses of 6 akutifana held in the Royal Ontario Museum show that their rainbow hues come from a vast range of products. The blues derive from indigo, the black from tannins and iron, and yellow from turmeric, likely dyed locally from at least the 1860s. The characteristic magenta of early akutifana comes from several sources: safflower, lac, and even cochineal, none of which was ever cultivated in Madagascar, thus confirming the import of pre-dyed skeins. Brazil wood and Prussian blue were also detected. By the 1880s at least, weavers had come to incorporate synthetics. This piece, for instance, contains basic violet number 3, which was patented in 1883. Given that the cloth was likely acquired in 1885, it shows how quickly synthetic dyes spread around the world. In yet other instances, such as this green, Malagasy weavers mix natural and synthetic dyes. Perhaps they wished to obtain a precise shade. More likely, they were hedging their bets, as early synthetics were known to fade quickly. So historically, in fact, museums weren't the only skeptics on anilines. Finally, the motifs revealed an equally wide range of local and external inspirations, including European needlework. Imerran authored 19th century texts, combined with interviews with contemporary weavers, suggest that the figures were secular in nature and unrelated to rank. What scholars have interpreted as birds or trees, the Malagasy know by the name embroidery, that's this figure here, and interpret as a generic plant. Buttonhole, spinning top, and cross shape are the names of other common motifs. Interestingly, rather than elaborate the flower head, which weavers usually just represent by this little diamond shape, which was so important to European and Indian design, akutifana weavers emphasize instead the leaves of the plant. This may accord with the great symbolic weight of leaves in Madagascar, which are associated with life, renewal, and well-being. This Malagasy adaptation of foreign forms and dyes returns us to the notion of hybridity. Being sensitive to the possibility of blendings and mixings allows us to rethink the complex and dynamic history of two of Madagascar's greatest textile arts. Yet my sweeping survey of geography and time today should not detract from our recognizing in these ikats and brocades art forms that are wholly, unmistakably, and uniquely Malagasy. Thank you very much.